Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This is our last normal session for the All Align North Carolina's Fight for a Fair Map Summit. Today we have Peter Miller from the Brennan Center to come lead this session on what makes a public comment effective. So I will go ahead and introduce Peter, and then I will hand it over to him for his presentation. Peter Miller is a researcher at the Brennan Center focusing on redistricting, voting, and elections. His research interests include US and comparative politics, voting behavior, political institutions, and public opinion. One of Miller's articles on redistricting commissions was cited by the US Supreme Court in the Arizona State Legislature versus Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission, and he is a frequent commentator on topics related to redistricting reform, voting rights, and elections. And he's here today to talk to us about some research that he has done on what actually makes for effective public comments in redistricting processes. So Peter, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Lekka. It's a pleasure to be able to join everyone on Saturday to talk a little bit about redistricting. The cycle is just about to get started, so now is probably a good time to be thinking about how people can get involved, what they can do to advocate for maps in their area. And a lot of that's going to involve public comment in field hearings that will be put on. So I've got a few slides to present just to talk about some of my research that was conducted in the last cycle of redistricting, and then we'll open it up to questions. So hopefully I can try and give some tips and guidelines for what makes an effective comment when it comes time to talk in front of a legislative committee. So, excuse me. I'll just be briefly describing the research that I conducted in the 2011 redistricting cycle. This was research that contributed to my dissertation and then was published in the Election Law Journal, a peer-reviewed academic interdisciplinary journal I'll talk a little bit about that article, and then I'll just comment on tips for the 2020 cycle as we're getting going. Looking back on the motivations for the paper that I worked on with my advisor, Bernard Groffman at the University of California, Irvine, we wanted to know the extent to which private citizens, public officials, or group representatives can successfully advocate for a change to a map that they have in mind in a given redistricting cycle. Of course, redistricting, as I'm sure most of the audience knows, is an extraordinarily technical area of policymaking, law, and political science. And therefore, the concern, at least among a lot of the academics, is that it's a lot of this inside baseball, in the sense that elites run the process, private citizens have virtually no purchase into advocating for their interests, and as a result, the interests of the public writ large are ignored when the maps are actually produced. And we had broad ideals of, well, we're going to travel around the country, we're going to collect all of these data. We ultimately ended up reducing the scope of the project just to the Western United States, in part because the Western United States had a distinct characteristic that we liked: variation in the institutions that drew lines. And so, back east, most of the redistricting is done by the legislatures in the states themselves. In the West, we have a number of states have adopted these independent or partisan appointed, commissions that could draw the map. And the idea might be that these commissions may be more willing to listen to the public than a legislative committee might be. But the real premise behind the paper is a question that was presented to one of the hearing in Nevada, where a member of the public gets up and says, "You're required by law to hold these hearings across the states and get public input. Does it really matter? Will you truly consider our opinions?" And of course, this is a nice encapsulation of the research that we're working on, precisely because it points to this question of what purchase do average people have into these processes. The literature on this aspect of redistricting is quite small, and so we had to do a lot of hand waving or references to other works in order to sort of put our contribution in context. And we did that around trying to form two potential models of public involvement in the redistricting process. The first is a slightly more cynical approach to redistricting, which is to say, these public hearings are a sham and they're going to be ignored, manipulated. The elites will get what they want. There is some evidence to suggest that this is the case if you look at, say, the redistricting in the last cycle in Florida, where the legislature had a series of hearings, and yet litigation after the maps were put in place demonstrated that a lot of the public comment had been orchestrated by either consultants or other elite members in the process. And so the question is, like, what's the purpose of these hearings if the decision has already been made in advance? There was a public comment public contest in Virginia where a team of academics put together a competition where groups or teams would draw maps and then submit these maps. The winning map of this competition would then be submitted to the legislature in Virginia. We can then go back and compare the contestant maps to the maps that the legislature actually drew, and the public drawn maps were better in whatever regard you cared about. And yet that winning map was not submitted to, or was not considered by the legislature. And so the question is, well, if we're looking for good solutions, we should have more points of entry for the public rather than just stick with whatever the legislature can come up with. By contrast, we could have a more idealist vision of these hearings, and we could say something like, the purpose of policymaking is to get a wide range of inputs into the system, get a sense of what's important to the actors in the question that is being considered, and then deliberate upon that and use these public comment hearings not as a means for elites to push their will, but rather for there to be a sort of public deliberative exercise in redistricting. In the end, we were able to collect data from 22 public comment hearings across the Western United States. These were the data for these comments were collected over 7 months in 2011, and in total, we include something like 937 discrete comments that we look at to see if they are represented in the final maps. Let me just summarize some of these results. The first question, of course, is, can the public provide meaningful information? And the point here is to say, were people able to articulate concerns that are directly relevant to redistricting? And we find yes. About 64% of all of the comments that we were collected in the course of this project were what we called feasibly mappable, meaning that they included a location and some sort of instruction. So this could mean, I want my neighborhood in District 1, or I don't want my neighborhood with that other neighborhood, or something like that. Some variation on that theme is what we required for a instruction to be feasibly mappable, in the sense like, could we look at a map and see if that comment was adopted? So the good news is that people are able to generate ideas that are directly relevant to redistricting for the authorities in their states to consider. When we turn to a separate question of, are these comments adopted in final maps, we also find evidence to suggest yes. In total, about 44% of the subset of all of the comments that were feasibly mappable were actually adopted in the final maps. In the states that presented both draft maps and final maps, in Arizona and California, we even see an improvement in the rate of public comments that are adopted if we compare the draft maps to the final maps, suggesting that the rounds of public comment actually improved the map in the eyes of the public. We might imagine that interest group representatives are more likely to have their suggestions adopted rather than, say, private citizens or public officials. We couldn't actually find that that was the case in all instances. The best we can say is that private citizens and public officials were more likely to have their suggestions adopted rather than group representatives. So in the sense like, if you were, say, the executive director of an interest group, you're less likely to get your comments adopted, but there's no difference between private citizens or public officials testifying at these hearings. There's also no significant difference between accepted comments by legislatures or commissions, but courts are less likely to adopt comments than either legislatures or commissions. So in one sense, we were unable to find any institutional difference, at least on the basis of these data. Presumably there'll be subsequent studies that may be able to find something heading into the next cycle in the West. The one key element that jumped out in the data, however, is that public comments covering a smaller area were much more likely to be adopted than public comments that involve a larger area. So let me just delve in on that for just a moment. With reference to the 2020 cycle, I think that the key point here is to keep the scale of your comment small and talk about neighborhoods rather than counties, if at all possible. So on the right on this screen, I'm showing you the sort of pre and post redistricting. The area in green is the city of Pleasanton, California. And as you can see in the map that was drawn in 2002, it was the existing map when the commission in California was put in place. You can see that the city of Pleasanton is divided between two congressional districts, the 13th and the 11th district. When I went to public comment hearings in the Bay Area to get a sense of how people thought that the map that had been previously drawn was behaving, one point that people raised was that the city of Pleasanton is split into two districts, and they thought that it would be better if the city was kept whole. And as you can see from the image on the right, that was in fact the case, and that the city was contained completely within the 15th congressional district after the redistricting had been completed by the commission in California. So the good news here is that people were able to articulate their interests and the commission was responsive to those concerns. However, if you were asking something like keeping a vast area, like multiple counties in a single district, it's unlikely that that can be adopted. At least they were far less successful as the area of the concern covered by a comment is expanded. The second point is to explain to these redistricting authorities why the comment is important to you. So for the folks in Pleasanton, for example, what is it that motivates their interest in having the city contained in a single district? Why is that better than the status quo? And these could be things ranging in all sorts of ways. And a lot of these may be elements that you can come up with on your own, but the one point that's usually articulated by municipal government, say mayors and city council members and so forth, is that it's easy for a city to articulate its needs to Congress if there's only one person they need to contact. The interests among, say, private citizens at the neighborhood level is, well, we like our city to be together because we play in the same football leagues, or we play in the same athletic competitions, or our kids go to schools that are proximate to each other, or these sorts of interests that define what it is that why it drives the interest in either having a place stay together or some variation on that theme. And when you're thinking about why things are important, you may also want to deliberate upon what are you willing to sacrifice in order to get the intent of your comment. Because redistricting is a multifaceted, as I mentioned, a pretty complex process. And if you're going in front of a redistricting authority and you say, I would like my city to be kept in a single district, that may imply that the resulting district may appear somewhat less compact or may have other features as a result of trying to adhere to the interest that you're trying to articulate, giving the authorities a bit of guidance on what you're willing to compromise on can be helpful. And just in the sense of the redistricting authorities tend to be overwhelmed with information and they have to make difficult decisions, some of which may say nibble at the edges of the intent of these public comments, precisely because they have to satisfy a number of often competing criteria. And lastly, I would advise that any group that is trying to organize campaigns around particular features of a given district map avoid repeating scripts wholesale, meaning that you don't want people to get up and say the exact same thing in front of these commissions or legislatures, in part because the legislatures and commission members who do the act of redistricting get pretty good at detecting when people are, say, repeating things from a script. And they tend not to pay as much attention to that. At least the folks that I talked to in the course of my research were mentioning that that was one immediately apparent factor that came along with the public comments. So I think one element that you might use to ground your comments in redistricting is around the concept of a community of interest, and sort of a vaguely defined term, but it's common in redistricting to articulate the sort of interest in a group of people who usually live close to each other and have some sort of common element together that might justify a redistricting exercise protecting that community for one reason or another. And the general question is sort of like, who are your neighbors? Who are the people that you would think of when you think of where you live? What defines that neighborhood? What's important about it? There are a couple of online services that have come up that can be used to draw these things. I can include the links here from both Representable and Districtor. Note the spelling error is intentional here. And so both of these websites allow you to, say, draw a physical map around a city park or a monument or your house or a school or whatever other location is important to you, in order to demonstrate, here's what I think of when I think of my community. And then you can take that map to a redistricting hearing and say, here is my community of interest. Here's what defines it. Here are the borders of it, the characteristics that are within this community, and the unifying interest that the redistricting authority should try and preserve when they're drawing a map that involves this area. So with that, let me stop my prepared remarks. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'd be happy to take any questions that folks might have related to public comment in redistricting. Thanks, everybody.
All right, so I think the question I see at the bottom of the chat right now is whether or not you can offer some more examples besides compactness that might be persuasive around sort of things that you would kind of want to give up to get what you want in redistricting.
Sure. Well, so I think that one nice example of this was, in general, when I was watching these public comment hearings, people would say, we'd always want our neighborhood or our city kept together. The only instance in which I saw someone advocate for split my city in half was the mayor of Redmond, Washington, who came up and said, and even premised his comments by saying, I know that this is something that you don't hear very often, but I want our city split in half into 2 congressional districts. And then he explained why having 2 people in Congress that he could contact might be helpful in certain circumstances. And so then the sort of give and take here is, well, if we want the city split in half, then the question is, well, where's that line going to be? And he proposed a demarcation line to split the city in half. That might be one area in which you might say, we're okay if we say don't include the western suburbs, but do include the eastern suburbs. Or here's what I think of when I'm referring to the larger metropolitan area of, say, Irvine, California, where I did my graduate work. That might be a more difficult thing to discuss rather than, say, the municipal borders that can be pretty easily found by an authority. Another example of this, also based in California, was there were 3 cities in the San Francisco Bay Area that consider themselves a community of interest. And so then the question is, we want these 3 cities drawn together. And even more confusingly, the 3 cities refer to themselves in a sort of portmanteau of the 3 names. As I recall, it's like La Moraga. And the commissioner is then looking at a map and he instantly becomes very confused and then says, can you point where this place is on a map? I can't find it, because it's the cities of Lafayette, Orinda, and Moraga. And he didn't know that, and it was only based on local information that you would be able to say, oh, if there's even a name by which everyone refers to this area, that must mean that there's something more that's going on than just three cities that are adjacent to each other on a highway, some variation like that. So that's sort of what I mean in the sense of when you're saying what you're willing to give up. Obviously, these three cities were interested in being held together, and it was very important to them that they define a district that included those three cities, which may also include different configurations at the borders.
So Jack is asking, do the public comments that you looked at just include sort of live verbal comments given at these in-person hearings, or did they include, online comment or anything else like that? Because I know that people are thinking about COVID and how that's going to kind of change the process. And if not, would you think that they would have the same effect? Yes or no? I mean, I know that calls for speculation, but I think it's something people are really thinking about because of the pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that going back to the earlier redistricting cycle, a lot of this web conferencing technology was in its infancy. As I recall, when I was in Oregon, they had a relatively revolutionary process at the time where they had most of their hearings were in Salem, where the legislature is based, and yet they would then have virtual hearings that would move around the state. And so there were a team of people who were driving a webcam to various different places so that you could have the central hearing was in Salem, and then you had sort of satellite hearings elsewhere in the state where people could tune in and give comments as if they were in person. The California Commission in the last cycle also allowed people to submit plans by email. So you would often see someone get up and say, I have 2 minutes to speak in front of the commission, so I'm going to be very brief, and then I'm going to include a longer email to the commission. When we went a subset of the email submissions versus the public comments in the same hearings, there weren't a lot of variations in terms of what people were saying by email as opposed to what was being said in person. So at least based on the evidence that I was able to gather in the earlier redistricting cycle, I don't see much of an effect of the sort of computer aided element of redistricting. That being said, COVID is one element that clearly is going to require a dramatic change in how public comment hearings as a matter of legislative business will be conducted. That being said, I don't have any indication to suggest that people don't pay attention when comments are being submitted over the web. That seems, if anything, it's going to be the vast majority of how comments are going to be provided in this cycle, just given the complexities of having people to gather for the purpose of a public hearing. The other element to think about is that legislatures are designed to get information from the public. And if they do that, the medium is, in this instance, not the message. That if we want to go back to the famous phrase about media studies, the more important thing is the content of the comment, and the vehicle by which it's delivered, at least as far as I could tell, was not determinative of whether or not the comment would be adopted in the end.
So I know earlier what you said about sort of you didn't see a lot of difference in the influence between ordinary people and maybe other kind of institutional stakeholders making these comments in terms of what got incorporated. So Nadine is asking sort of if that's the case, then what's the role for organizations like All Online, like my organization, or Common Cause, or other organizations that kind of advocate around redistricting stuff? When it comes to these comments, how are these organizations playing a role if their comments are not, listened to any more than anyone else's?
Right. So I guess one point is like the interest groups sort of fill an intermediary zone between the general public and political parties, right? And so they're used to sort of distill the interests of their members in one way or another, and we could see that in the redistricting process where you would have someone get up and say, I'm from a labor union, and what matters to me is our members indicate that the corridor on Interstate 101 is the important barrier for this the district, and so therefore we're advocating for this rather than something else. You could also see and this was often the case in hearings that were in larger cities. You would have some group that would get up and say, we represent the so-and-so, interests or whatever, for the sake of the example, the Peter Miller Foundation, and they're a notoriously litigious group of people, and they're getting up and they're saying, well, here's what matters in terms of redistricting, in the sense of, we want districts that are equal population. We want districts that are preserve municipal boundaries. While those may be helpful comments for guiding the redistricting authorities, there may not necessarily be feasibly mappable, in the sense that if you say something like, we want districts that have equal population, well, one, that's now at this point, I think, a pretty rock solid precedent in terms of redistricting, given the lineage of Supreme Court cases around this point. And two, it's difficult to look visually at how a district is configured to see if they have equal population. And so it may be that the interest representatives are pursuing sort of more encyclopedic knowledge about the redistricting process, rather than how a particular district should be configured, which tended to be articulated by the private citizens. The other point to recall, and this may be surprising, is that in the course of all of these hearings, the vast majority of public comments were provided by private citizens. And so we don't have sort of an equal sample of private citizen comments and interest group comments, and then can compare one to the other. If anything, more than 80%, if I'm recalling correctly, of all of the comments were provided by private citizens. The scope of interest groups also tended to be larger, in the sense that they would say things like, we're interested in, in a case in Nevada, they wanted a congressional district that included, I think, 4 or 5 counties as a unit. And the problem was that these counties were not adjacent all to each other. So it wasn't one like region of the state. And so then you're looking at this and thinking like, this is going to be pretty difficult to implement, just because the complexity of redistricting is such that if units are not adjacent, it becomes difficult to include them, just because districts have to be contiguous. So which is not to say that interest groups have no role in the process. It's just rather, and you may want to take a step back and articulate, here's what we might be able to do. One comment that was effective, but we don't consider in the paper, was looking at a housing complex in Brooklyn in New York City, where the entire membership of this housing complex wrote a petition and said, you draw the district at 23rd Street, and yet the housing complex continues to 26th Street. And so for the purposes of our housing community, we want to be in a single district. Can you change that border? And so it was effective for someone to get up and say, I have a petition signed by 1,200 people. Here's what we want. And when I spoke to the members of the task force in New York after that, they were like, well, this is an easy one. We can adopt this very quickly. So that might be one way in which interest representatives are able to articulate the preferences of their members.
Yeah, and just to say, sort of from our perspective, our goal is really to sort of, give people the knowledge, like you just did with your presentation, to be able to make the comments and support them in kind of accessing and knowing when they are and how to participate. But we're really relying on our volunteers to be the ones who actually know what their communities look like, know what they want to ask for, know how they want, the district to look where they live. So we're sort of in the business of trying to support them to get to that point and know, for example, how to make a feasibly mappable comment, but the content of the comment is really hopefully up to them. So Virginia asked just about the nuts and bolts of making comments of hearings, how do you find out about it? And just to say, from a North Carolina perspective, here in the state, it tends to go on the state legislative website. So I think that's ncleg.gov or something like that. And that it's, so unfortunately, it's not as widely publicized as we would hope here in North Carolina. I think they kind of make it more difficult than it needs to be, but it's always on the legislative website. And of course, we will do our job trying to amplify that and make sure that ahead of time. Similarly, online comment also in the past has been basically just like a link thrown up on the state legislative website. So that's hopefully answering that question for you, Virginia. And as far as the mechanics of it, the way it tends to work is you show up to the public hearing. When the public hearing is, you show up, you tend to kind of put your name on a list as you come in, and then they'll call on you and you'll get your 2 minutes or whatever to make comments. Martha asks, does the public comment have to come from a resident of that community? Is it okay if you live in the same county but not the exact same city as it's happening? Did you get any information about that?
Yeah, I saw all sorts of variations. There might be people who say, I'm a resident of this neighborhood, and here's why it matters to me. You could also have people show up and say, I don't live there, but here's what I think should happen. You might also have weirdos who actually, study redistricting, and they show up and say, here's the optimal combination of all of these neighborhoods in a different region of the state that's not covered by where this public comment is. I know there was one fellow in the Washington cycle in the last, Washington state in the last cycle. He went to every public comment hearing and he had comments on every region of the state, even though he didn't reside in any of these places. And just in the sense of his eye looking at a map and saying, well, here's what makes sense to me. So I don't think there's any geographic restriction on what you're able to comment on or not. And it may just be based on what you're most comfortable discussing. I know a lot of academics will often draw district maps or even statewide maps on their own and then submit them and say, well, here's my idea. But that might require a bit more involved, say, computer technology or something like that. Though districtor and representable do make that much easier now in the sense of it's pretty simple to draw even simple maps and just say, here's roughly what I'm articulating when I'm saying, well, my community of interest is important to me because of X, Y, and Z. I wouldn't worry too much about whether or not you're a resident of the neighborhood you're in, if it's an adjacent county, if it's a different city, if it's a different region of the state. Anything, I think the more important thing is the reasoning behind why this district is being drawn in the way that you would prefer.
I think that's super interesting because I think it may be counterintuitive for some people. I know that people live in counties. I think Martha, I know her, she's from Guilford County, and it's a place where a lot of different municipalities are being split up and dealt with in a lot of different ways. And people who live in that county, kind of have a good idea of what's happening there. So Cheryl asks, in your research, did you observe any states that produced really effective public outreach programs that resulted in a lot of public participation? If so, what were some elements of those programs?
Yeah, so the states under consideration had a variety of different ways in which they appeal to the public. One, as like I suggested, was a posting on the legislature's website saying there will be a hearing in Salt Lake City, 7 o'clock, stop by the community center, and something like that. And that was part of the reason that it was difficult to gather some of these, the data here is that here I am trying to find places to travel as I'm, say, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and thinking, okay, there are 3 hearings in this region in the next week. Which one can I go to? And it was all based on how the legislature would be providing these notices of public hearings. The California Commission got above and beyond in terms of they would put press releases in local newspapers. They would have appearances in local media describing, hey, everyone in Riverside, the commission is coming to get a hearing. Come talk about redistricting. And they would do this sort of a traveling salesman show of going around the state and trying to get as many hearings in as possible. And so that they were able to cover vast regions of the state just by traveling around, plopping down and saying, okay, let's hear what the people have to say in Northern California or in San Francisco or the Central Valley or Inland Empire, any of these different regions. The commission went beyond, I thought, what they needed to do just to satisfy the statutory requirements and actually trying to get as much comment as they could from the public. It varies. The one general observation I made was that commission states tend to have more hearings than the legislative states, but the legislators who are actually drawing these maps also tend to be extraordinarily busy with everything else that they're doing in the legislature. Whereas commissioners, this is all they do. And so they're able to focus on it to a greater degree that I think might explain why these commissioners are suddenly available for an order of magnitude more hearings than, say, a legislator might be able to do. And commissioners are able to travel around the state rather than being required to stay in the Capitol in the event of a vote being called or something.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I think one thing we've been talking about in North Carolina is obviously we're probably not going to get a really reformed process, but there are transparency and public input measures that we can advocate for. And I think one of these that may be really good is this thing, sort of like making sure they're putting out press releases and maybe like local ads in local papers and things like that, that really can drive people to these public hearings, instead of just kind of throwing it up on a legislative website somewhere and hoping that people find it. So Adrian asks, when you're making public comments, does it make sense to bring groups of people together to, have a coordinated strategy to cover a bunch of different aspects of the maps? Or is it more effective when a bunch of people repeat the same point? Did you see a difference with that in terms of like the places where you saw people saying the same thing versus people having a bunch of different opinions?
Right. I think that the most common comment that was provided in the California hearings was they wanted three cities, the Carson, Compton, and Long Beach, drawn into the same district. And why this rolls off the tongue is I heard it time and time again. But what was lacking was some sort of explanation as to why these, they would say something like these cities are similar, so keep them together. And it seemed like after a while, the commissioners would see, or they would hear Carson and they would just know the next one's going to be Compton. And if you got the two of them, almost certainly someone's going to say and Long Beach too. And I thought that while it was the most common comment, it wasn't actually adopted in the final maps. And there could be a variety of reasons for that. One of which might be, if you look at these three cities together, you're already at about, as I recall, I want to say, no, I can't remember the number. So I'm just going to say that if you're looking at the population equality, you draw these three cities together, you're already at a pretty close limit to where you need to be in terms of the size of a district. So it might be difficult to implement it that way. But the other thing to think about is you could have, say, a group of people get together and the first person get up and say, I think Carson, Compton, and Long Beach should be drawn into one district. Here's one reason why. And then someone else can get up and say, I agree with the earlier comment, but here's a different reason why you should have it. Or here's a third reason, or here's a fourth reason, or these variety on a theme. So you could say collaborate on the general thesis that you're trying to present to these redistricting authorities, and then have different justifications, given that you may only have a short period of time to talk about these redistricting comments. One way to do that might be portion up the reasoning why to various speakers, and they can articulate different elements rather than just repeating the same script wholesale.
So Jenny is asking, and I know your paper wasn't directly on this, but did you see any evidence of legislators maybe listening to comments about the process as well as comments about the districts? I know you focus on sort of what you call feasibly mappable comments, but was there evidence that they were responding to any of the criticisms or about the process?
Yes. And so this is an excellent question, in part because if we break down the feasibly mappable comment rate by state, you'll see that Utah is very low in terms of feasibly mappable comments. And that's precisely because most of the people who testified got up and said, we should have a commission that draws the districts. And sadly, that's not a feasibly mappable comment. But I think it informed the legislators in the sense of what the people wanted, in the sense that there may have been an inherent suspicion that folks in Salt Lake may not get what they want from the state legislature. And I think that fueled some of the efforts to have a commission of sorts introduced in Utah by means of a ballot measure that was passed in 2018. The remit of that commission has been restricted a bit by the legislature since then. But I think that the point here is that while the paper was only looking at feasibly mappable comments, there are a lot of other things that can be articulated in terms of the process of redistricting. It may not be helpful in terms of getting a feature of a map adopted, but they may be things that are important for legislators or other redistricting authorities to hear. And one comment might be, you're not having enough hearings. And that might be one indication that either a commission or a legislature needs to do maybe a little more legwork and kind of figure out how to get more hearings put on the schedule so that people can comment on that process.
So Harry is asking, how meaningful would comments be that point to clear incidences of packing/cracking, but don't actually cite where lines should be moved? So I know that, earlier we had a mathematician come and talk to us about how they analyze maps, and I assume we will see some sort of outside academics giving their analysis and saying, we think that these districts are packing Black voters or something like that. Like, did you see any of that kind of comment happening, and was it also effective?
Yes, and it depends on the speaker, and this was not an element that we spent a lot of time thinking about in the production of the paper, in part because these sorts of comments were very rare, in the sense that there would be someone that would get up. Here in California, everyone wears Hawaiian shirts, so you couldn't tell what the person was going to say in advance, and they would get up and say something like, "I think District 17 is a racial gerrymander because it splits up this population and that population, or it draws these people together, and I think what it's doing is producing some sort of unconstitutional practice." And it may be just the politics of the time in California, but the commissioner seemed quite responsive to those types of concerns, precisely because the sort of secret of redistricting is you want a map that survives almost inevitable litigation. And so one thing that can be said is like, okay, well, if someone is articulating a district configuration that they think is unconstitutional, one is just a private citizen, so we have no way to say adjudicate the legitimacy of the claim, but that might be important for a commissioner to know about as they're drawing a map. If it gets to the stage where you have special masters drawing districts, as was the case in Colorado and Nevada and New Mexico. Sorry, I have to, now we're calling things a decade ago. The court seemed quite responsive to those concerns. The problem there is that in the court context of districting and public comment hearings is very constrained, in the sense of in New Mexico, you had to be a litigant to the case in order to articulate those claims. The special masters in Nevada actually held public comment hearings, and they went around the state and said, well, what do you like about this map or don't like about that map? And that might be an indication which someone could make something of a more legal analytical comment. For the purposes of private citizens, it may just be important to say, I'm uncomfortable with how this district is drawn, and here's an articulation as to why, whether or not the law is a point of law that you're presenting is open for interpretation. Thankfully, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just looking at it as a social scientist. And so if people get up and say, I'm concerned about the configuration of District 7, then that might be something that will inspire people to look into it.
Okay, so I think there are a couple more questions I want to try to give you before we close out. I know there are a ton of questions in the chat that we are just not going to be able to get to, and I really apologize for that. We're really going to have you come back and give like some other kind of talk where we can cover, where we have some more time to address these. But so the first questions, second to last question I'm going to ask you is, did you see the same approach, this is from Keith, being more effective in rural areas versus urban areas? Did it was it the same across the board, or were there any differences there?
I didn't see much of a difference. The people who came to these hearings are obviously self-selected. The hearings that I was able to attend tended to be close to airports, in part because I had to get to another hearing pretty quickly afterward. But the neat thing, at least is in the places that I saw, was that the hearing sort of served as a gathering point, and you would have people get up and say, even if the hearing is in, say, Golden, Colorado, someone's going to comment on a different city and say, here's why I think this is important. Or one comment that I loved in Idaho was they had said, move the district to 6 Mile Road. And I didn't know what that was. So I make a note and I look at a map, and 6 Mile Road is this thing out in the middle of nowhere. And it's like, oh, okay, well, that's an easy thing to accomplish, because then we can just look and see, did the district move to this border? And so I think that the more important thing, not say urban or rural differences, is just the articulation of what you want the district to look like and why you want it that way. And the neat thing is, I'll have to go back and look if 6 Mile Road was actually adopted in Idaho, but the neat thing is that required a lot of local knowledge that presumably folks that live there might have, that folks that are coming from somewhere else don't have the context.
Okay, so this is the last question, and this is from Ford. So to what extent do you feel your research is applicable here in North Carolina, where, the legislature draws the maps? We have, a Republican majority legislature. So, we know who's going to be drawing the maps, and we don't have a commission. So, you have looked at a lot of states that do have commissions and things like that. So, do you think that the incentives to listen to public comment differ in a place like like North Carolina, where we have the legislature drawing the maps, or, or is it more the same than we thought?
Yeah, so it may be that the experience in California might be more optimistic than we might observe in North Carolina and other states where the legislature controls the process. But I think it can be informed in the sense that compare, say, Utah to North Carolina, because at the time Utah also had one party in control of the process, and it was legislative drawn districts that were being produced. You similarly at the time had a Democratic controlled legislature in New Mexico and a Republican governor. So you could almost anticipate what the concerns that were going to be at loggerheads between the legislature holding the hearings and the governor ultimately signing the redistricting bill. That may not be directly applicable, given that North Carolina has an exceptional process where the governor has no ability to veto a districting plan. But you may be able to, through analogy, find other legislative avenues that might be more relevant to the North Carolina experience. The justification for the study was, well, here's an area of the country in which we have some things that look like other things and some things that look like each other. So in the sense, like, we've got commission states, we ended up with a couple of court-drawn maps, and then we also had legislative maps that I think give it a degree of diversity that might be more indicative of how things would work nationwide. It's just that the eastern states may resemble the legislative processes more than the commission-drawn processes, just as a function of local politics.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much, Peter Miller of the Brennan Center, for coming and talking to us about this. I think this is a really fascinating topic, and we may again have to have you back, because clearly people were really interested and wanted to ask a lot of questions. But thanks for giving us this basis. And we are next going to go to our keynote by Eric Holder. So Eric Holder is going to be with us. He's going to be doing this keynote speech. He's going to also be answering some questions. The link that you will use to access the keynote is different. You will find it in the email that you got after signing up. I'm also going to put it in the chat so that you have it, so that you can join. And we will be meeting there at 2 p.m. So please join us then for our sort of closing event for the summit, which has been great. We've had great attendance, we've had great interest, we've had lots of really wonderful speakers. And so we will see you all in a little bit, and we will all get to listen to Eric Holder, which is one of my favorite things to do. So, all right, thank you again, Peter, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone. This was a joy. Enjoy your weekend, and maybe we'll be in touch. Take care.
Bye.